says they want this feature, that feature will be built. So feature parity is also sometimes like a definition of success when it comes to enterprise software. Not so much when it comes to consumer software, because you might not have all the features that your competitor has, but those 2 or 3 features that you have are so mind-blowing that people still continue to like install your app or engage with your app. So before I go on to the next section, I can pause now and like, does anyone have any questions, comments, feedback?
Yeah, so Namrata, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, so my name is David. So we work with Ford. So the question is, we all use Facebook, right? There's a tool,
Yeah.
internal use, this workplace thing, right? That is the enterprise of Facebook. Initially, it
Facebook
was
work.
work something, right? Workplace. I mean, work. Yeah, forgot it. So I'm just saying, initially it was all great, but then no, not interested. So there's no stuff. I was just telling. I could relate to the same
Yeah,
product,
yeah,
same user, different the same consumer enterprise thing. Maybe I'm not interested. I don't know. Yeah, just sort of sharing
yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I get that. Yeah, like it's a very different ball game being on like Facebook for work, and like versus being on like just Facebook for the consumer. Because Facebook for work, you're probably thinking about like not so interesting personas. Like you're thinking about like IT admins, whereas Facebook, you're actually thinking about like people like you and me who are like using Facebook. Yeah.
Yeah, just to add on, right? So I think we started using Yammer. Yammer was redesigned by me,
Oh,
and that is more cleaner now,
yeah,
rather than more cluttered the other way. I'm just
yeah, yeah.
just from a experience perspective, I was just telling you. Thanks.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Does anyone else have any experiences they want to share or any comments or feedback before I jump into the next section? If not,
You had a
then
question in Prakriti as well.
oh sure.
You want to take that up right now?
Is it tied to the first half of the presentation? Then sure, I can take it up right now. I can't see the screen though. I can't see where the question is.
I can. Okay, so we can probably take it up later.
Okay, cool. Awesome. So yeah, I think now I'm jumping into the next part, which is similarities. So I think I spent like the first major chunk of the presentation trying to clarify as to like what you should be thinking differently. And like a quick short summary of that would be when who uses the product is very different. So when you're designing for a large enterprise, you're thinking about people who are doing like coordinated software, whereas when you're designing for an individual, you're thinking about that specific person using your product. So thinking about different roles in an organization is important for like enterprise software. I think it's also important when and where someone is using it. So, like, are they using it on the go versus like using it on a large screen? I think it's also important to understand, like, whether they are casual users or power users, and like designing, keeping in mind that someone is going to spend long hours in your tool, or like whether they're coming in to accomplish a short task. Now, switching to similarities, or what I am calling this section as believing in the basics, because I feel these are some things which are true irrespective of whether you're designing for a consumer product or whether you're designing for an enterprise product. And I think people who have been in design for some time might already know what's going to be in the next section. But I think it's important to care about simplicity, even if it's enterprise software. And being enterprise software by its nature is complex. I mean, enterprise software supports jobs of various types, and many of these jobs are not inherently easy to do. Like it's your job to be an IT admin. I mean, you train to become an IT admin. It's not like as simple as like booking Uber or booking a ticket on Make My Trip. These are complex tasks. Like onboarding a new person into a company is a way more complex task than ordering food on Zomato. Similarly, a task of like designing software, like a tool like Figma that I use, is more complex than like say booking a trip on Airbnb. So these are definitely more complex tasks. However, they don't have to be complicated. When I say complicated, I mean things like again, like clutter, like things that show up which are not important. But I also say complicated, like me making me do 15 more steps when you know that I am you doing this particular activity day in and day out. So I think every software, whether it's consumer software or enterprise software, needs to still get a task done. In enterprise software, the tasks tend to be more complex just by the nature of the fact that these tools are supporting someone's job. However, they do not need to be complicated. I think you should still strive for simplicity even in enterprise software. It's just simplicity does not mean minimalism or like less UI. I think simplicity means understanding the your user's task flow so well that you can actually optimize and make things more efficient for that particular user. Research is still important. And I think if you look what I've called out, like for enterprise also, you need to talk to customers, you need to talk to the support staff and sometimes sales staff and look at product data. For consumers also, you need to talk to customers, support staff and look at data. I think especially for enterprise, why you're doing research is slightly different. I think for enterprise, you're doing research mostly things like field research. You need to know how an organization works, you need to know how Walmart works, you need to know how another customer like Verizon works. These are large companies, the way they function are very different. A healthcare company functions very differently from say a law firm, and being able to understand the functioning of these companies is important, for which you need research. On the consumer side, you need research to understand to a certain extent on the tactical end of things like usability, but on the more strategic end of things, being able to identify patterns of behavior that change because of introduction of say a new type of technology. You can say, for example, like a lot of users in India are probably coming on to mobiles for the first time because Geo became really cheap. What does that have implication for software? So being able to also being able to understand like what are some of the reasons why customers are dropping off from your consumer product, what is out there in terms of like understanding the competitive landscape becomes very important for consumer products, because like I mentioned earlier, a lot of times you're selling sizzle and the consumer is making a choice, like he's individually making a choice when it comes to deciding whether to use your product. So those are some of the reasons why you would probably do research in the consumer space. But in both spaces, research is still important, and this is something that I believe is we share, like both these spaces share in common. And lastly, I think this is important because I feel a lot of times when people think of enterprise products, they think that they are going to not look good. I think aesthetics still matter. Enterprise software is not really an excuse for shitty visual design and like making things look like in quote unquote ugly. But however, I think it should not be confused with minimalism. I think what ends up happening, especially with consumer software, you don't want to have too much information on the screen, or you don't want you are can be more experimental. I think on the enterprise side of things, I think it's not great to experiment, especially because this is someone's job. But that does not mean that it cannot look good. I think large amounts of information can also be displayed in a really nice way. And like I think it's still important, like I mentioned earlier, to show only information that matters, even for large enterprises. But again, as we had discussed earlier, in enterprises or in enterprise software, you probably want to see a lot more information because that's important to your job than you would in you wouldn't say a consumer software. But at the end of the day, I think aesthetics still matter. A good example of this would be something like Slack, where they actually invested a lot in terms of the overall aesthetic of the product. And I think going back to the first half of the talk, where we saw that nowadays products can exist on a spectrum. So you could be a calendar app, you could be an email app, and you exist somewhere in between on the between a consumer and an enterprise software. And especially in this zone, like you still are appealing to an end user, and you definitely should not sacrifice aesthetics in that kind of an arena. And yeah, with that, I can end my talk and we can jump to questions.
All right, let's start. Kunal, is he still here? Kunal, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question? Doesn't seem like it.
Hey, hi Utkarsh.
Yeah,
Hi.
yeah.
Hey, so I had a query that usually apps and the consumer-facing apps, they tend to be quite intuitive and, as you mentioned, minimalistic and kind of user-centric. On the contrary, a lot of times these enterprise apps, especially those where are like back-end activities are involved, say ops team or HR teams, right? They
Yeah,
don't so aesthetically pleasing, which
yeah,
sometimes they are sometimes confusing as well. So the user adoption may not be that great. So one of the ways of doing it is like you train the team, but as you know, say a few new folks join, right? And then
yeah,
they don't have the clarity. So a lot of times the user adoption falls in these
yeah.
cases. So what are the things we can consider in design that can kind of make these go up? Can it be something like tutorials, or what can be the other nudges that can improve the user adoption?
Yeah, I think more than tutorials, I feel like tutorials can sometimes be like, I think it's important, like I had called out earlier, for you to understand, like, if say for example HR is finding it hard to use your tool, and like tutorials help when it's like a one time learning and that's it. But like even in that one time learning, you can make certain tasks intuitive, depend if you understand the HR workflow really well. So if you know that the HR every month has to onboard like 20 users into that company, and like this is how they usually do, seeing all the workarounds they make around your tool, being able to go observe that, which is why I think to a certain extent field research, or like it's called contextual inquiry, but being basically able to see someone at workplace use their tools is very important for you to understand how they're using your tools, to be able to make it like more intuitive. And I think tutorials are useful if you are actually trying to, like, upfront training cost does happen in with large enterprise software. But I think it's like you mentioned, if adoption is falling or people are actually like leaving the app and doing workarounds, that means that there is overall usability issue with the software, which requires some investigation. I have a feeling that enterprise software ends up like not getting a lot of this love, because, or like a lot of this investigation is because once you make the sale to a large company, there's usually like a contract for like a year and a half, and like large, then they don't get incentivized to actually like put in the effort to like change the software, which is slowly changing though. Yeah,
So basically, I have observed two things over here. First is that the one you mentioned, that the buyer and user are not the same. And
exactly.
secondly, like especially in places where these tools can lead to automation, a lot of times even I have tried to do job shadowing, but the teams are not so kind of forthcoming in telling what they do on a daily basis, because they have a risk associated that it might reduce what they are doing manually, right? And one
Yeah,
more
yeah.
thing I've observed is that so as you mentioned, suppose earlier the company was working with a different software vendor, and the team is used to that. So even if you try to propose a feature that works really well, but they are like, no, we want to do the Excel upload thing only, or we want to do it the old way, basically.
Yes,
And
yes, yeah, that's actually very good point. I think change aversion is huge. So, like consumer space, and I think this maybe requires its own slide. This is a great point you called out. But like, I think change aversion in the consumer space, people are able to overcome way more quickly than in the enterprise space. A quick anecdote was like, I went on a research trip where I saw a new company adopt or move from Microsoft to G Suite. So using Microsoft Outlook, Excel, to using Google Gmail, and Google Sheets. And there were so many people that were really upset by that move. We met a lot of people who were like, I'm used to using my Outlook inbox a certain way. I don't like using Gmail. Gmail is good only for my personal email. I don't know why they're trying to move us to Gmail. So, but like you mentioned, a lot of times, even if the like you might think, or like the sales team might be trying to pitch that, hey, this is actually way more easier to use. You're right that there's way more change aversion in enterprise products than there is in like consumer products. Yeah.
Yeah, that's it from my side. So yeah.
Thanks for bringing up that great point.
So I've put a question in the chat. The question is, how do you come up with personas in Chrome and Google Maps, right? How did you come up with
Yeah.
that? What was the method? Thanks.
Yeah. I think for especially for Chrome and Google Maps, because they are apps used by a lot of people. We undertake this exercise of like market segmentation. So for one, trying to understand like the different geographies in which we are important. So like in India versus US versus UK, that's one level of like parsing. Understanding audience. uh, and I think the second level would be to understand like within those countries the market, so like segmentation by say socioeconomic factors or by demographic like age, to see like patterns that like a certain usage behavior that's way more common in say someone who's coming and using the internet for the first time versus younger users in the US. You probably might use products a certain way. So that's like one level of like market segmentation we do. Personas, I don't think we do personas as much as like I think traditionally how you have a persona where you're like, this is Kiara, she goes to work every day in so and so car. I think we don't have personas like that. I think we lean towards the side of like archetypes, which is more heavily tied to how someone is using your product. So you for Chrome, one archetype would be the person who is like if you used to call them like the tech forward archetype. So someone who is like an influencer who's very like popular on Twitter, and like is someone who would be an early adopter to products. And you would have another archetype in would be someone who is like we would call it like the slow adopters. So people who don't really go and look at uh, like for a tech forward person, they actually will go and look at like compare between what is the difference between like a Chrome browser versus Edge browser versus Mozilla Firefox. Whereas the slow adopters would be people who would probably choose Chrome because it was like default installed on their computer, or they are using Edge not because of the fact that like they actually care about it, but it's because it's like the default browser. And you have another demographic, like we would call them like more socially minded people. So people who end up making a software choice because someone told them, like friends and family told them about it. So I don't use Mozilla Firefox because I personally went and did analysis about it. I use Mozilla Firefox because my close friend told me that use Mozilla Firefox because of AYZ reasons, or like a tech influencer told me to use Mozilla Firefox, and that's why I use it. So I don't know whether this answers your question, but basically like that's how we would come up with like personas. Like one personas, I would rather call it archetypes, like more tied to how they would approach or use the product, and also based on things like markets and demographics. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Makes sense. Thanks.
Akriti, do you want to ask a question?
Actually, let me stop presenting my screen because I can't see everyone's faces. So I'll switch.
Actually, I got the reply in second last slide. So
Oh, okay. What was the question?
so I wanted to know that like the question was, can we say that designing for consumer needs more work on user research part compared to enterprise?
Oh, okay. No. I think that they both require research, just like slightly different focus of research. I also feel like I think on the consumer side of things, there is generally a push for research in the I think in the first half when you're coming up with like a new feature. I think people tend to like slow down a little bit of research once the feature is launched, and then they tend to focus a lot more on like in product metrics to be like, hey, people are not using it and why people are not using it, focusing on that. I think the struggle there is to remind people on the consumer side that, hey, we still need to do some amount of research now that the feature is launched. We still need to understand why people are dropping off, and let's invest in, I think, qualitative research. I think on the enterprise side of thing, what ends up happening is there is a lot of research again initially to understand behavior of like say a large company. But as I mentioned and I discussed in the previous question with someone, what ends up happening on the enterprise side is like people are okay with once the sale is done, enterprise company is not incentivized to improve their product sometimes. And I think that is the thing that is slowly changing. I think most enterprise companies used to be sales first more than like design first. So you could get away with having like a shitty design for your enterprise software because you've already made the sale. And I think that's changing. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
No, no worries.
Okay, we have Rajat. Rajat, do you want to ask a question? Rajat, can you hear us? Okay, so this question is straightforward. I'm not sure how to answer that. So, how do you prioritize user experience versus feature parity in B2B products?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think specifically also because I mentioned feature parity as like one of the reasons why people make a choice when buying an enterprise product. And I think this is a constant struggle. So I guess when you add a new feature to a product, it generally tends to increase the complexity sometimes of getting to another feature, or it's really buried. So definitely adding, when you keep adding features, it does make the product experience a little bit harder. I think the trade-off is probably made, to be honest, based on revenue. So in B2B products, if you build that one extra feature, if it's going to get like a large customer like Walmart to use your product and you're going to get a lot of revenue from it, that's probably going to be defining why you're building out that feature. And at that is the cost that will be justified for why like this a feature has made it slightly harder, say for example, to see all the information, or this one feature has made it slightly harder to like say access something. There are ways to increase the number of to include features without leading to like a big downgrade in the overall user experience, but definitely there is like a trade-off, and a lot of times it comes down to revenue. Cool. Utkarsh, there are a couple of questions.
Right. So these questions are received from internal creators of product team, and
okay.
when I told them that we'll be having this session with Namrata, they posted it to over here. Although they couldn't join, these are the questions. So I'll start with the first one, which is one of the important questions. Let's say you're designing for an enterprise. A lot of your work is covered under NDA, which is a non-disclosure agreement. How do you show it in your portfolio? And this is, I mean, it's very true for product designers. As a sort of PM role, I have been facing the same problem a lot of times. I just say, I can't show it. I can't show anything.
Yeah.
How do I do that? I mean, how do I do it?
That's a good one, because like even I ended up having this initially. So before I joined InstaMojo, I used to work for a consultant, but their customer was Standard Bank of South Africa, which was an enterprise customer, which obviously didn't let me share whatever I designed for them to others. So I think in those cases, being able to, like I sort of did today, if you guys noticed, I did not use too many UI mockups in my presentation. I didn't actually show the UI and the changes that happened in it. For similar reasons, because like in a lot of cases I can't, and I'm not sure whether Google will allow me to show all of this without like approval. And I think that's to say you can still talk about your work. I think it comes down to things like being able to talk about your impact. So say for example, you actually made a change which led to like time to finish the task like became shorter, or led to like a higher adoption. I think being able to talk about that. So to be honest, portfolio is a way for you to get in the door to have an interview. And I think in portfolio, what people are scanning for very quickly are like, what is the impact you made in this particular product? And they also want to see to a certain extent, what is your thinking behind this change? And you can also showcase your thinking with, like, say, without showing your UI, you could say, for example, earlier it used to take this much time and we did this kind of research and which led to a change in workflow without having to actually show the specific screens. And I think once you're in ready for the actual interview, when you're presenting your work also, like I sort of did, like I showed you cards and table, like I alluded to the UI, but I didn't really show you the actual UI. That's also certain ways in which you can say that, hey, these are some changes that I made which led to this, but I can't show you the actual UI. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks for that. Right, so I have two other questions, but I'll still ask if anybody has any questions, they can put it over here. And in the meanwhile, I'll take those. So, okay, so the next question probably oriented more towards for a product manager, but I still want to know what role a designer plays, especially in a large company like Google. You have filled the question, but I'll still repeat it for the audience, which is, on the enterprise side of design, how can one go about balancing or taking the design decision, comparing two customers over here, which is one of the customers who pay a large portion of the revenue, and versus the other kind of customers, where let's say the revenue is less, but now how? Okay, so yeah, that's the question.
Yeah, No, but I get it. I think it also is specifically challenging in the case that the people who are paying small, they pay small revenue, but they account maybe for like 80% of your users. And like 20% of your users are like large customers who are paying the big money to actually use your product. And I think over here, it's definitely like a ongoing conversation. I think it also becomes to a certain point strategic. I would say, like, in case of a large organization, it might just be above my pay grade to be able to make that call. But in like a smaller organization, the strategic being that, are we going to be a large enterprise company or are we going to be a small or medium business company? I personally know that because like when I was working on like Google admin, earlier it was supposed to be designed for like a small and medium business. So you can imagine like a 20-person startup, or like a max 100 people in a company, that kind of organization. That's what the tool was initially designed for. And I think there was like a strategic choice made by Google as a large company that we are going to go after large customers, and we are going to go after people which have more than 1,000 people at least in their company. And I think that comes down a little bit to making that strategic call, because otherwise it always ends up happening that you are torn between making a design call or decision for like these small businesses versus large businesses, and the roadmap then ends up being dictated by that strategic call. Like someone somewhere has to make a call that, we are going to be a large enterprise tool, and it's okay if we have only 3 customers, but they are large customers. That decision is usually difficult to make because people see the trade-off sometimes, like, oh, we have like a large number of people using us and we can't alienate that user base. But I have noticed that usually what ends up happening is like money ends up dictating which direction the what do you say, the organization tends to make that decision. Yeah.
I understand. Thanks for that. Okay, so we have a new question from Karthik. I think we have time, so we can take this up. Karthik, do you want to unmute yourself and ask this question?
Hey, yeah. So the consumer apps, I know there is a lot of leeway to do A/B testing and figure out what works best. And consumers, might not be, since the user base is more, you can do all those. But in enterprise apps, you don't have all those freedom and do all those things and change that, right? So how would it?
So I think that's another good point. I feel like I'm getting a lot of content even from talking to you guys, which I need to include in the deck. But like, yeah, you're right that you can't do A/B testing in enterprise app. I think how we compensate for it at least is we do this thing called trusted tester, where you would have like one or two companies which are like your small group of they are called trusted testers, so they opt in to this experience of like being the first one to receive changes. And what ends up happening is usually we release these changes to those set of companies or those set of users, receive feedback from them, and like we also have like a customer satisfaction score or a CSAT score. So like if with the trusted testers the CSAT score is low, then we have to go back and look at what we have done and make changes. There is no concept of A/B testing, you're right, because of the fact that like you can't A/B test such large companies workflow changes. It'll cause like a huge controversy. So we end up doing things like trusted testing. So I think even the release cycle in an enterprise world is way slower. So in consumer space, you just ship and you ship multiple versions, and then you get like feedback, and then you choose with the winning version. In the enterprise release model, you would probably first do trusted testing. Then there's something known as GA launch or general availability, where this goes out to a larger set of users. And I think there's a checkpoint to see whether the customer satisfaction score is the same or has dipped. And then it ends up going to like a lot of people. So I guess the answer to this is like to do analysis, we end up doing the trusted tester launch to understand whether people like those people have signed up for the fact that we're okay with seeing changes in our UI. So you need willing customers who are willing to provide you feedback. Yeah. And investing in like early research. We also end up doing like a lot of early research before even the change is implemented, like going to people's offices and showing our design. Yeah.
All right, thanks for that question. Okay, so we have one final question that is from me. If there are no other questions, that after this we'll end the session. Folks, you still have time. I'll go ahead with my question. So this is kind of, let's say, hypothetical question for the future.
Sure.
Just so while it's a bit designing for enterprises and for consumers is a little different right now, do you see them converging sometime in the future? Let's say on one of the fronts or multiple fronts, and how do you see them evolving this thing? Again, so we talked before we started, we talked about how pandemic changed some of the things in Google Maps. What are the other trends again? Not something like pandemic, but what are the other trends that you see? What are again? So first question is if you see them converging on multiple fronts, and the second is the patterns or the changes that we plan.
Yeah, so I think definitely there are certain areas in which they are converging. I think which is why at the beginning I had shown that spectrum, because there are a lot of apps now which were either initially designed for enterprises and are now being used by consumers, like Zoom. Like Zoom was initially like designed mostly as like a software that you would use in a company for VC software, like video conferencing software, and now is like a good Skype replacement for a lot of us. And on the other hand, like things like email, which were initially Gmail is like a consumer product, but now it's becoming slowly like an enterprise product because there's opportunity in the enterprise space. So I feel like the convergence is going to happen a lot more also because of like our lifestyles. I think a lot of us are also working and working in the same browser, and we are also like booking our movie tickets and all in the same browser. So there's a lot of overlap in terms of like a space. There is no distinct workspace versus a personal space, because of which like there's a lot more convergence in certain products that you would use. Like I guess the pandemic just accelerated that. So you came to rely a lot more on software to do a lot of things out in the world because you couldn't go out into the world. So that is definitely like a pattern that I see, and I think the design implication for it is probably the fact that even people's bar for what they consider like well designed is higher now. So I think initially enterprise software ended up suffering from the fact that, it's not easy to look at. It's not supposed to be something, but I think all of that is changing because people's bar for what they expect from software has become way higher. So you are less tolerant if say an enterprise software gave you like like a 15-second or like a sort of 20 seconds wait time to upload a particular file, because you're like, why is it harder to do it in this particular software versus like the consumer software? So I think expectations are also sort of resetting, which is actually good for enterprise software, which is why you have products like Slack. Slack is technically for enterprise software for like large companies, but I think the way it's designed has been designed also keeping like end users in mind. So yeah, definitely I feel that as people's consumption of software goes higher, the bar for enterprise software is also going higher. People are less tolerant of, I guess, shitty UI. Yeah.
That is true. That is definitely true. Wow. So I think we are this is the end of the session. Since there are no other questions, thank you so much, Namrata, for
Thank you,
joining
guys.
us today.
Yeah. Thank you. Have a
It's
great
early
time.
morning for you over there, right?
Yeah, it's quite early for me. Yeah. I'll go have coffee and breakfast now.
Okay, then. Please have that. Thank you, everyone, for joining, for asking your questions. We had a great session today. Okay, then. Goodbye. Good night,
Awesome.
everyone. Good morning, Namrata.
Bye.
Have a happy weekend.
Yeah, you too.
Bye.